Chapter 3, Part 1 of The Planet Strappers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Planet Strappers by Raymond Z. Gallun. Chapter 3, Part 1. On June 1st, 10 days before blastoff, David Lester came back to the shop, sheepishness, pleasure, and worry showing in his face. "I cleared up matters at home, guys," he said, "and I went to Minneapolis and obtained one of these." He held up the same kind of space fitness card that the others had. "The tests are mostly passive," he explained further. "Anybody can be whirled in a centrifuge, or take a fall. That is somewhat simpler, in its own way, than clinging to a careening motor scooter. Though I do admit that I was still almost rejected. So I'll join you again, if I'm permitted. I understand that my old gear has been completed as a spare. Paul told me. Of course I'm being crusty in asking to have it back now." Les, I'm sure that's okay," Ramos grunted. "Right, fellows?" The others nodded. A subdued cheerfulness seemed to possess Lester, the mama's boy, as if he had eased and become less introverted. The bunch took him back readily enough, though with misgivings. Still, the mere fact that a companion could return after defeat helped brace their uncertain morale. "I'll order you a blastoff ticket, Les," Frank Nelson said, "in one of the 2 GOs, ground-to-orbit rockets, reserved for us. The space is still there." David Lester had won a battle. He meant to win through completely. Perhaps some of his determination was transmitted to the others. 2 and 2 Baines, for example, seemed more composed. There wasn't much work to do during those last days after the equipment had been inspected and approved, the initials of each man painted in red on his blastoff drum, and all the necessary documents put in order. Mitch Story rode a bus to Mississippi to say goodbye to his folks. The Cusacks flew to Pennsylvania for the same reason. Likewise, Gimp Hines went by train to Illinois. Ramos rode his scooter all the way down to East Texas and back to see his parents and a flock of younger brothers and sisters. When he returned, he solemnly gave his well-worn vehicle to an earnest boy still in high school. "No dough," Ramos said. "I just want her to have a good home." Those of the bunch who had families didn't run into any serious last-minute objections from them about their going into space. Blasting out was getting to be an accepted destiny. There was a moment of trouble with 2 and 2 Baines about a kid of 8 years named Chippy Potter, who had begun to hang around the Hendricks just the way Frank Nelson had done long ago. But more especially, the trouble was about Chippy's fox terrier, Blaster. "The lad, of course, can't go along with us out there, on account of school and his mom," 2 and 2 said sentimentally, on one of those final evenings. "So he figures his mutt should go in his place. Shucks, maybe he's right. A lady mutt first made it into orbit, ahead of any people, remember? And we ought to have a mascot. We could make a sealed air-conditioned box and smuggle old Blaster. Afterwards, he'd be all right inside a bub." "You try any stunt like that and I'll shoot you," Frank Nelson promised. "Things are going to be complicated enough." "You always tell me no, Frank," 2 and 2 mourned. "I know something else," said Joe Kuzak. He and his tough twin had returned to Jarviston by then, as had all the others who had visited their homes. "There's a desperate individual around again. Tiflin. He appealed his test and lost. Kind of a good guy, some ways." The big Kuzaks, usually easy and steady and not too comical, both had a certain kind of expression now, like amused and secretive gorillas. Frank wasn't sure whether he got the meaning of this or not, but right then he felt sort of sympathetic to Tiflin, too. "I didn't hear anything. I won't say or do anything," he laughed. Afterwards, under the pressure of events, he forgot the whole matter. It would take about 36 hours to get to the New Mexico spaceport. Calculating accordingly, the bunch hoisted their gear aboard 2 canvas-covered trucks parked in the driveway beside Hendricks, just before sundown on their last day in Jarviston. People had begun to gather to see them off. 2 and 2's folks, a solid, chunky couple looking grave. David Lester's mother, of course, seeming younger than the bunch remembered her. Makeup brought back some of her good looks. She was more Spartan than they had thought, too. "I've made up a basket of sandwiches for you and your comrades, Lester," she said. Otto Kramer was out with free hot dogs, beer, and Pepsi, his face sad. J. John Reynolds, backer of the bunch, had promised to come down later. Chief of Police Bill Hobart was there, looking grim, as if he was half glad and half sorry to lose this passel of law-abiding but worrisome young eccentrics. There were various cynical and curious loafers around, too. There was Chippy Potter and his mutt. A more wistful and worshipping pair would have been hard to imagine. Sophia Jamison, one of Charlie Reynolds' old flames, was there. Charlie had sold his car and given away his wardrobe, but he still managed to look good in a utilitarian white coverall. "Well, we had a lot of laughs anyway, you big ape," Sophie was saying to Charlie, when Roy Harder, the mailman with broken down feet, shuffled up, puffing. "One for you, Reynolds," he said. "Also one for you, Nelson. They just came. Ordinarily, I wouldn't deliver them until tomorrow morning. But you see how it is." A long white envelope was in Frank Nelson's hands. In its upper left-hand corner was engraved, "United States Space Force, Recruiting Section, Washington, D.C." "Geez, Frankie, Charlie, you made it. Open 'em quick," Two and Two said. Frank was about to do so, but everybody knew exactly what was inside such an envelope. The only thing that was ever so enclosed, unless you were already in the force, an official summons to report on such and such a date and such a place for examination. For a minute Frank Nelson suffered the awful anguish of indecision over a joke of circumstance. Like most of the others, he had tried to get into the force. He had given it up as hopeless. Now, when he was ready to move out on his own, the chance came. Exquisite irony. Frank felt the lift of maybe being one of, well, the chosen. To wear the red, black, and silver rocket emblem, to use the finest equipment, to carry out dangerous missions, to exercise authority in space, and yet to be pampered as those who make a mark in life are pampered. "Qui milagro! Holy cow!" Ramos breathed. "Charlie, Frankie, congratulations!" Frank saw the awed faces around them. They were looking up to him and Charlie in a friendly way, but already he felt that he had kind of lost them by being a little luckier. Or was this all goofball sentiment in his own mind to make himself feel real modest? So maybe he got sentimental about this impoverished ragtag bunch that, even considering J. John Reynolds' help, still were pulling themselves up into space almost literally by their own bootstraps. He had always belonged to the bunch, and he still did, so perhaps he just got sore. Charlie and his eyes met for a second in understanding. "Thanks, Postman Roy," Charlie said. "Only you were right the first time. These letters shouldn't be delivered until your next trip around, tomorrow morning." They both handed the envelopes back to Roy Harder. The voices of their bunch mates jangled in a conflicting chorus. "Ah, you damn fools," Two and Two bleated. "Good for them," Art Kuzak said, perhaps mockingly. "Hey, they're us. They'll stay with us. Shut up. Didn't we lose enough people already?" Gimp said. Frank grinned with half of his mouth. "We always needed a name," he remarked. "How about the Planet Strappers? Hell, if the chairborne echelon of the USSF is so slow and picky, let him go sit on a sunspot." "I need some white paint and a brush, Paul," Ramos declared, running into the shop. In a couple of minutes more, the name for the bunch was crudely and boldly lettered on the sides of both trucks. "Salute your ladies, shake hands with your neighbors, and then let's get moving," Charlie Reynolds laughed genially. And so they did. Old Paul Hendricks, born too soon, blinked a little as he grinned and slapped shoulders. "On your way, you lucky tramps." There were quick movements here and there, a kiss, a touch of hands, a small gesture, a strained glance. Frank Nelson blew a kiss jauntily to Nancy Cottis, the neighbor girl, who waved to him from the background. "So long, Frank." He wondered if he saw a fierce envy showing in her face. Miss Rosalie Parks, his high school Latin teacher, was there, too. Old J. John Reynolds appeared at the final moment to smile dryly and to flap a waxy hand. "So long, sir. Thanks," they all shouted as the diesels of the trucks whirred and then roared. J. John still had never been around the shop. It was only Frank who had seen him regularly every week. It might have been impertinent for them to say that they'd make him really rich, but some must have hoped that they'd get rich themselves. Frank Nelsen was perched on his neatly packed blast-off drum in the back of one of the trucks as big tires began to turn. Near him, similarly perched, were Mitch Storey, dark and thoughtful, Gimp Hines, with a triumph in his face, 2 and 2 Baines biting his lip, and Dave Lester with his large Adam's apple bobbing. So that was how the bunch left Jarviston, on a June evening that smelled of fresh-cut hay and car fumes, home. Perhaps they had chosen this hour to go because the gathering darkness might soften their haunting suspicions of complete folly before an adventure so different from the life they knew. Neat streets, houses, beds, Saturday nights, dances, struggling for a dream at Hendricks, that even if they survived the change, the difference must seem a little like death. Seeking the lifting thread of magical romance again, Frank Nelsen looked up at the ribbed canvas top of the truck. "Covered wagon," he said. "Sure, Indians, boom boom," 2 and 2 chuckled, brightening. "Wild West, yeah, wild. That's a word I kind of like." Up ahead in the other truck, Ramos and Charlie Reynolds had begun to sing a funny and considerably ribald song. They made lots of lusty, primitive noise. When they were finished, Ramos, still in a spirit of humor, cornered up an old Mexican number about disappointed love. "Adios, mujer. Adios para siempre. Adios." Ramos wailed out the last syllable with lugubrious emphasis. "Always it's girls," Dave Lester managed to chuckle. "I still don't see how they expect to find many out there." "If our Eileen has, or will, make it, she won't be the first or last," Frank offered, almost mystically. "Hey, I was right about the word wild," 2 and 2 mused. "Yeah, we're all just plumb full of wanting to be wild. Not mean wild, mostly constructive wild instead. And damn, we'll do it. Cripes, we ought to come back to old Paul's place in June, 10 years from now, and tell each other what we've accomplished." "Damn, that's a fine idea, 2 and 2, Dave Lester piped up. "I'll suggest it to the other guys, first chance I get." Of course, it was another piece of callow whistling in the dark, but it was a build-up, too. Coming home at a fixed future time to compare glittering successes. Eldorados found and exploited, cities built, giant businesses established, hearts won, real manhood achieved past staggering difficulties. But they all had to believe it to combat the icy sliver of dread concerning an event that was getting very near now. Mitch Storey sat with his mouth organ cupped in his hands. He began to make soft, musing chords, tried a fragment of Old Man River, shifted briefly to a spiritual, and wound up with some eerie, impromptu fragments, partly like the drums and jingling brass of old Africa, partly like a joyful battle, partly like a lonesome lament, and then, mysteriously, like absolute silence. Storey stopped abashed. He grinned. "Reaching for out there, Mitch?" Frank Nelsen asked. "Music of your own to tell about space. Got any words for it?" "Nope," Mitch said. "Maybe it shouldn't have any words. Anyhow, the tune doesn't come clear yet. I haven't been there." "Maybe some more of Otto's beer will help," Frank suggested. "Here, 1 can each to begin." For once, Frank had an urge to get slightly pie-eyed. "High's a good word," he amended. "High and sky, Mars and stars." "Space and race, nuts and guts," Lester put in, trying to belong and be like-minded, like he thought the others were, instead of a scared, pedantic kid. He slapped the blast-off drum under him familiarly, as if to draw confidence from its grim, cool lines. The whole bunch was quite a bit like that, for a good part of the night, shouting lustily back and forth between the two trucks, laughing, singing, wisecracking, drinking up Otto Kramer's Pepsi and beer. But at last Gimp Hines, remembering wisdom, spoke up. We're supposed to be under mild sedation, a devil killer, a tranquilizer, for at least 30 hours. It's in the rules for prospective ground-to-orbit candidates. We're supposed to be sleeping good. Here goes my pill down with the last of my beer." Faces sobered and became strained and careful again. The guys on the trucks bedded down as best they could among their gaunt equipment. Soon there were troubled snores from huddled figures that quivered with the motion of the vehicles. The mottled moon rode high. Big tires whispered on damp concrete. Lights blinked past. The trucks curved around corners, growled up grades, highballed down. There were pauses at all-night drive-ins, coffees misguidedly drunk in a blurred, fur-tongued half-wakefulness that seemed utterly bleak. Oh, hell, Frank Nelsen thought. Wasn't it far better to be home in bed, like Jig Hollins? At gray dawn, there was a breakfast stop, the two truck drivers and their relief man grinning cynically at the bunch. Then there was more country, rolling and speeding past. Wakefulness was half sleep and vice versa, and the hours through the day and another night dwindled toward blast-off time at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. When the second dawn came, the bunch were all tautly and wearily alert again, peering ahead across the dun desert. There wasn't much fallout from the carefully developed hydrogen fusion engines of the GO rockets, but maybe there was enough to distort the genes of the cacti a little, making their forms more grotesque. Along the highway there were arrows and signs. When the trucks had labored to the top of a ridge, the spaceport installation came into view all at once. Barbed wire fences, low, olive-drab gate buildings, guidance tower, the magnesium dome of a powerhouse reactor, repair and maintenance shops, personnel housing area, carefully shielded against radiation by a huge stellene bubble, sealed and air-conditioned, with double-doored entrances and exits. Inside it were visible neat bungalows, lawns, gardens, supermarkets, swimming pools, swings, a kid's bike left casually here or there. The first sunshine glinted on the two rockets and their single attendant gantry tower waiting on the launching pad. The rockets were as gaunt as sharks. They might also have been natural spires on the moon, or ruined towers left by the extinct beings of Mars. At first they were impersonal and expected parts of the scene, until the numbers, ceramic enameled on their striped flanks, were noticed. GO11 and GO12. "They're us, up the old roller coaster," Charlie Reynolds shouted. Then everyone was checking his blast-off ticket, as if he didn't remember the number primly typed on it. Frank Nelsen had GO12. GO, ground to orbit. But it might as well mean go, glory, or gallows, he thought. The truck reached the gate. The bunch met the bored and cynical reception committee, a half-dozen USSF men in radiation coveralls. Each of the bunch held his blast-off ticket, his space fitness, and his equipment inspection cards meekly in sweaty fingers. It was an old story, the unknowing standing vulnerable before the knowing, and perhaps harsh. Nelsen guessed at some of the significance of the looks they all received. Another bunch of greenhorns, to conquer and develop and populate the extraterrestrial regions. They all come the same way, and look alike. Poor saps. Frank Nelsen longed to paste somebody, even in the absence of absolute impoliteness. The blast-off drums were already being lifted off the trucks, weighed, screened electronically, and moved toward a loading elevator on a conveyor. The whole process was automatic. 9 men, 10 drums. How come? One of the USSF people inquired. A spare. Its GO carriage charges paid, Reynolds answered. He got an amused and tired smirk. "Okay, sexy. It's all right with us. And I hope you fellas were smart enough not to eat any breakfast. Of course, we'd like to have you say, tentatively, where you'll be headed. Up on your own power after we toss you upstairs. Toward the moon, huh? Like most fledglings say. It helps a little to know. Some new folks start to scream and get lost up there. See how it is?" "Sure, we see, thanks. Yes, the moon." This was still Charlie Reynolds talking. "No problem, them sexy. We mean to be gentle. Now let's move along in line. Never mind consulting wristwatches. We've got over 4 hours left. Final blood pressure check first. Then the shot, the devil killer, the wit sharpener. And try to remember some of what you're supposed to have learned. Relax, don't talk too much, and try not to swallow any live butterflies." The physician, looking them over, shook his head and made a wiry face of infinite sadness when he came to Gimp and Lester, but he offered no comment except a helpless shrug. The USSF spokesman was still with them. "All right, armor up. Let's see how good you are at it." They scrambled to it grimly and still a little clumsily. Gimp Hines had, of course, long ago tailored his Archer to fit that shrunken right leg. Then they just sat around in the big locker room, trying to get used to being enclosed like this much of the time, checking to see that everything was functioning right, listening to the muffled voices that still reached them from beyond their protecting encasement. They could still have conversed by direct sound or by helmet radio, but the devil killer seemed to subdue the impulse, and for a while caused a dreaminess that shortened the long wait. "Okay, time to move." Heavy with their Archies, they filed out into the desert sun glare that their darkened helmets made feeble. They arose in the long climb of the gantry elevator and split into two groups, for the two rockets, according to their GO numbers. It didn't seem to matter now who went with whom. Each man had his own private sweating party. The padded passenger compartments were above the blast-off drum freight sections. "Helmets secure, air restorer systems on, phones working? Answer roll call if you hear me. Baines, George." "Here," 2 and 2 responded, loud and plain in Frank Nelson's phone, from the other rocket. "Hines, Walter." One by one the names were called. "Kuzak, Arthur. Kuzak, Joseph." "Okay, the Mystic 9, huh? Lashdown." They lay on their backs on the padded floors and fastened the straps. Gimp Hines, next to Frank, seemed to have discarded his crutches somewhere. The inspector swaggered around among them, jerking straps and tapping shoulders and buttocks straight on the floor padding with a boot toe. "All right, not good, not too bad. Ease off, shut your eyes maybe. The next 20 minutes are ours. The rest are yours, except for orders. I hope you remember your jump procedures. Also, there are a lot of wooden nickels upstairs, in orbit, on the Moon, any place. We'll call some of your shots from the ground. Good luck, and glory help you." The growl in their phones died away with the muffled footsteps. Doors closed on their gaskets and were dogged automatically. Then it was like waiting 5 minutes more inside a cannon barrel. There was a buzzing whisper of nuclear exciters. The roar of power cut in. A soft lurch told that the rockets were off the ground, fireborne. The pressure of acceleration mounted. You closed your eyes to make the blackness seem natural, instead of a blackout in your optic nerves, and the threadiness of your mind seemed like sleep. But you felt smothered just the same. Somebody grunted. Somebody gave a thick cry. Frank Nelson had the strange thought that, by his body's mounting velocity, enough kinetic energy was being pumped into it to burn it to vapor in an instant, if it ever hit the air. But it was that energy of freedom from gravity, from the Earth, from home for adventure. Freedom to wander the solar system at last. He tried still to believe in the magnificence of it, as the thrusts of the rocket power ended and the weightlessness of orbital flight came dizzily. He didn't consciously hear the order to leave the orbiting GO-12, which was moving only about 500 feet from its companion GO-11. But like most of the others, he worked his way with dogged purpose through what seemed a fuzzy nightmare. The doors of the passenger compartment had opened. Likewise, the blast-off drums had been ejected automatically and were orbiting free. Maybe it was Gimp who moved ahead of him. Looking out, Frank saw what was certainly Ramos, already straddling a drum marked with a huge red MR, riding it like a jaunty troll on a seahorse. He saw the Kuzaks dive for their initialed drums. Big men not yet as apt in this new game as in football, but grimly determined to learn fast. The motion was all as silent as a shadow. Then Frank jumped for his own drum and found himself turning slowly end over end, seeing the first pearl mist curve that was the earth, then the brown-black chalk-smeared sky with the bright needle points and the corona-winged sun in it. Instinct made him grab futilely outward, for the sense of weightlessness was the same as endless fall. He was falling around the earth, his forward motion exactly balancing his downward motion in a locked ellipse, a closed trajectory. His mind cleared very fast. That must have been another phase of the devil killer shot coming into action. Controlling panic, he relocated his drum, marked by a splashed red FN, set his tiny shoulder ionic in operation, and reached back to move its flexible guide, first to stop his spin, then to produce forward motion. He got to the drum and just clung to it for a moment. But in the next instant he was looking into the embarrassed and anguished face of a person who, like a drowning man, had come to hang on to it for dear life, too. "Frank, I even dirtied myself." "So what? Over there's your gear, 2 and 2. Go get it," Frank shouted into his phone, the receiver of which was now full of sounds, a moaning grunt, a vast hip-cupping, shouts and exhortations. "Easy, Les," Reynolds was saying. "Can you reach a pill from the rack inside your chest plate and swallow it? Just float quietly. Nothing'll happen. We've got work to do for a few minutes. We'll look after you later. Cripes, Mitch, he can't take it. Jab the knockout needle right through the sleeve of his Archer, like we read in the manuals. The interwall gum will seal the puncture." Just then the order came, maddeningly calm and hard above the other sounds in Frank's phone. All novices disembarked from GOs 11 and 12 must clear 400-mile takeoff orbital zone for other traffic within 2 hours. At once Frank was furiously busy, working the darkened stellene of his bub from the drum, letting it spread like a long wisp of silvery cobwebs against the stars, letting it inflate from the air flasks to a firm and beautiful circle, attaching the rigging, the fine radial spoke wires for which the blast-off drum itself now formed the hub. To the latter he now attached his full-size, sun-powered ionic motor. Then he crept through the double sealing flaps of the airlock to install the air restorer and the moisture reclaimer in the circular, tunnel-like interior that would now be his habitation. He wasn't racing anything except time, but he had worked as fast as he could. Still, Gimp Hines had finished rigging his bub minutes ahead of Frank or anybody else. On second thought, maybe this was natural enough. Here, where there was no weight, his useless leg made no difference, as the space fitness examiners must have known. Besides, Gimp had talented fingers and a keen mechanical sense, and had always tried harder than anybody. Ramos was almost as quick. Frank wasn't much farther behind. The Kuzaks were likewise doing all right. 2 and 2 was trailing some, but not very badly. "Spin 'em," Gimp shouted. "Don't forget to spin 'em for centrifuge, gravity, and stability." And so they did, each gripping the rigging at their bub rims, and using the minute but accumulative thrust of the shoulder ionics of their Archers to provide the push. The inflated rings turned like wheels with perfect bearings. In the all but frictionless void, they could go on turning for decades without additional impetus. "We made it. We're out here. We're all right," Ramos was shouting with fierce exultation. "Shut up, Ramos," Frank Nelsen yelled back. "Don't ever say that too soon. Look around you." Story and Reynolds were still struggling with their bubs. They had been delayed by trying to quiet Dave Lester, who now floated in a drugged stupor lashed to his blast-off drum. Slowly, pushed by their shoulder ionics, Gimp Ramos and Frank Nelsen drifted over to see what they could do for Lester. He was vaguely conscious, his eyes were glassy, his mouth drooled watery vomit. "What do you want us to do, Les?" Frank asked gently. "We could put you back in one of the rockets. You'd be brought back to the spaceport when they are guided back by remote control." "I don't know," Lester wailed in a hoarse voice. "Fellas, I don't know. A little falling is all right. But it goes on all the time. I can't stand it. But if I'm sent back, I can't ever live with myself." Frank felt the intense anguish of trying to decide someone else's quandary that might be a life or death matter which would surely involve them all. Damn weak-kneed kid. How had he ever gotten so far? "We should have set up his bub first, put him inside, and spun it to kill the sense of fall," Gimp said. "We'll do it now. He should be all right. He did pass his space fitness tests, and the experts ought to know." With the three of them at it, and with the Kuzaks joining them in a moment, the job was quickly finished. Meanwhile, the sharp, commanding voice of ground control sounded in their phones again. "GOs 11 and 12 returning to port. Is all in order among delivered passengers? Sound out if true. Baines, George." David Lester's name was called just before Frank Nelson's, and he managed to say "in order" almost firmly, creating a damnable illusion, Frank thought, but for a moment, mixed with his anger, Frank felt a strange, almost paternal gentleness, too. At the end of the roll call, the doors of the GO rockets closed. Stubby wings, useful for the ticklish operation of skip-glide deceleration and re-entry into the atmosphere, slid out of their sheaths. Little lateral jets turned the vehicles around. Their main engines flamed lightly. Losing speed, they dipped in their paths, beginning to fall. Watching the rockets leave created a tingling sense of being left all alone at an empty, breathless height from which you could never get down. A height full of dazzling, unnatural sunshine that, in moments, would become the dreadful darkness of Earth's shadow. End of Chapter 3, Part 1. Part 2 of The Planet Strappers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Planet Strappers by Raymond Z. Gallun. Chapter 3, Part 2. "Hey, our spare drum! It'll drift off!" Ramos shouted. The Kuzaks dived to retrieve the cylinder. Others followed, but there was a peculiar circumstance. The friction cover at one of its ends hung open. There was a trailing wisp of stellene, part of the bub packed inside, and a thin, angry face with rather hysterical eyes within the helmet of an Archer 5. "Shh! It ain't safe for me to come out yet," Glenn Tiflin hissed threateningly. "Damn you all, if you dare queer me..." "Cripes, another Jonah," Charlie Reynolds growled. Frank Nelson looked at the Kuzaks floating near. "Well, what could we do?" Joe Kuzak, the gentler twin, whispered. "He came back to Jarviston, to our rooming house one night. We promised to help him a little. What are you going to do with a character nuts enough about space to armor up and stuff himself inside a blast-off drum? Of course he didn't come that way from home. There's that electronic check of drum contents at the gate of the port. But he was there on a visitor's pass, waiting, having hitchhiked all the way to here. After the electronic check, he figured on stowing away while the drums were waiting to be loaded. The only thing we did to help was to take a little of the stuff out of the spare drum and stow it in our two drums to leave him some room. We thought sure he'd be caught quick. But you can see he got away with it. Those USSF boys at the port don't really give a damn who gets out here." "Okay, I'll buy it," Reynolds sighed heavily. "Good luck with the stunt, Tiff." Tiflin only gave him a poisonous glare, as the 9 fragile, gleaming rings, the drifting men, and the spare drum orbited on into the Earth's shadow. Not nearly as dark as it might have been, because the moon was brilliant. "We'd better rig the parabolic mirrors on the ionics to catch the first sunshine in about 40 minutes, so we can start moving out of orbit," Ramos said. "We'll have to think of food sometime, too." "Food yet? Ugh," Art Kuzak grunted. Frank felt the fingers of spasm taking hold of his stomach. Most everybody was getting fall sick now, their insides not finding any up or down direction. But the guys wavered back to their bubs. The shoulder ionics of their Archers, though normally sun energized, could draw power from the small nuclear batteries of the armor during the rare moments when there could be darkness anywhere in solar space. The Planet Strappers stood in the rigging of their fragile vehicles, setting the full-sized ionics to produce increased acceleration, which would gradually push the craft beyond orbit. Joe Kuzak ran a steel wire from a pivot bolt at the hub of his ring to tow Tiflin and his drum. Then everybody crawled into their respective bubs, most of them needing the centrifugal gravity to help straighten out their fall sickness. "My neck is swelling too," Frank Nelsen heard Charlie Reynolds say. "Lymphatic glands sometimes bog down in the absence of weight. Don't worry if it happens to some of you. We know that it straightens out." For a few minutes it seemed that they had a small respite in their struggle for adjustment to a fantastic environment. "Well, I got cleaned up some, that's better," Two and Two said. "But look at the fuzzy lights down on Earth. Hell, is it right for a fella to be looking down on the lights of Paris, Moscow, Cairo, Rangoon, when he hasn't ever been any further than Minneapolis?" Two and Two sounded fabulously befuddled. David Lester started screaming again. They had left him alone and apparently unconscious inside his ring, because all ionics, including his, had had to be set. Then, in the pressure of events, they had almost forgotten him. "I'll go look," Frank Nelsen said. Mitch Storey was there ahead of him. Mitch's helmet was off. His dark face was all planes and hollows in the moonlight coming through the thin, transparent walls of the vehicle. "Should we call the USSF patrol, Frank?" he asked anxiously. "Have them take him off? 'Cause he sure can't stand another devil killer." "We'd better," Frank answered quickly. But now Tiflin, having deserted his blast-off drum, was coming through the airlock flaps too. He stepped forward gingerly along the spinning, ring-shaped tunnel. "Poor bookworm," he growled in a tone curiously soft for Glenn Tiflin. "Think I don't understand how it is? And how do you know if he wants to get sent back?" Mitch had removed Lester's helmet too. Tiflin knelt. His arm moved with savage quickness. There was a crack of knuckles in a rubberized steel fabric space glove against Lester's jaw. His hysterical eyes glazed and closed. His face relaxed. For a second of intolerable fury, Frank wanted to tear Tiflin apart. But Mitch half grinned. "That might be an answer," he said. They plopped where they were and tried to rest until the orbiting cluster of rings emerged from Earth's shadow into blazing sunshine again. Then Mitch and Frank returned to their own bubs to check on the acceleration. It was soon plain that Joe Kuzak's bub, towing Tiflin's drum, would lag. "Hell," Art Kuzak snapped. "Get that character out here to help us inflate and rig his own equipment. We did enough for him. So, if the Force notices that there are 10 bubs instead of 9, the extra is still just our spare. Hey, Tiflin." "Nuts, I'm looking after Panty Waist," Tiflin growled back. "All right," Art returned. "So we just cast your junk adrift. Come on, boy." There was no kidding in the dry tone. Tiflin snarled, but obeyed. Ions jetting from the earthward hub ends of the rotating rings yielded their steady few pounds of thrust. The gradual outward spiral began. "Cripes, I'm not sure I can even astrogate to the moon," Two and Two was heard to complain. "I'll check your ionic setting for you, Two and Two," Gimp answered him. "After that, the acceleration should continue properly, without much attention. So, how about you and me taking first watch, while the others ease off a little?" Frank Nelsen crept carefully back into his own rotating ring, still half afraid that an armored knee or elbow might go right through the thin, yielding stellene. Prone, and with his helmet still sealed, he slipped into the fog which the tranquilizer now induced in his brain, while the universe of stars, moon, sun, and earth tumbled regularly around him. He dreamed of yelling in endless fall, and of climbing over metal-veined chunks of a broken world where once there had been air, sea, desert, and forests, and minds not unlike those of men, but in bodies that were far different. Gurgling thickly, he awoke and snapped on his helmet phone to kill the utter silence. Someone muttered a prayer in a foreign tongue. Nuestra Dama de Guadalupe, te pido por favor, tengo miedo, I'm scared, pero pienso más en ella. I think more of her, mi chula, mi linda, my beautiful Eileen. Keep her. The prayer broke off as if a switch was turned. It had been brash Ramos. Now there were only some fragments of harmonic music. Frank slipped into the blur again, awakening at last with Two and Two shaking his shoulder. "Hey, Frankie, we're 5 hours out. By the chronometers, look how small the Earth has got. We're all going to have brunch in Ramos's vehicle. Know what that goofball Mex was doing before? Stripped down to his shorts, and with the spin stopped for 0G, he was bouncing back and forth from wall to wall inside his bub. The sun makes it nice and warm in there. I think I might try it myself sometimes. Shucks, I feel pretty good now. Frankie, ain't you hungry?" Frank felt limp as a rag, but he felt much better than before, and he could stand some nourishment. "Lead on, Two and Two," he said. Ramos's bub was spinning once more, but he was wearing just dungarees. The bunch, the Planet Strappers, with only their helmets off, were crouched, evenly spaced around the circular interior of the ring. Dave Lester was there too, staring but fairly calm now. In this curious place there was a delicious and improbable aroma of coffee, cooked by mirror-reflected sunlight on a tiny solar stove. "So that's the way it goes," Charlie Reynolds commented profoundly. "We reach out for strangeness, then we try to make it as familiar as home." "Stew warmed in the cans too," Ramos declared. "Enough for a light one time around. I brought the stew along. Hope you birds remember. Then we're back on dehydrates. Hell, except for the weight problem and consequent cost of stuff from Earth, we'd have it made out here. The big vacuum ain't so tough. No storms in it, even, to tear our bubs apart. I guess we won't ever have a bigger adventure than finding out for ourselves that we can get along with space. If we had a beef roast, we'd put it in a sealed container of clear plastic," Gimp laughed. "Set it turning outside the bub on a swiveled tether wire. It would rotate for hours like on a spit, almost no friction. Rig some mares to concentrate the sun's heat. Space Force men do things like that." "Shut up, I'm getting hongry," Art Kuzak roared. Ramos poured the coffee in the thin magnesium cups that each of the bunch had brought. Their squeeze bottles for 0G drinking were not necessary here. Their skimpy portions of stew were spooned on magnesium plates. Knife and fork combinations were brought out. An apple puree, which had been powdered, followed the stew. Brunch was soon over. "That's all for now, folks," Ramos said ruefully. Tiflin snaked a cigarette out from inside the collar of his Archer. "Hey," Reynolds yelled mildly. "Oxygen, remember? Shouldn't you ask our host first?" Ramos had eased up on ribbing Tiflin months ago. "It's okay," he said. "The air restorers are new." But Tiflin's explosive nerves, under strain for a long time, didn't take it. He threw down the unlighted fag. He snicked his switchblade from a thigh pocket. For an instant it seemed that he would attack Reynolds. Then the knife flew and penetrated a thin taut wall to its handle. There was a frightening hiss until the sealing gum between the double layers cut off the leak. The Kuzaks had Tiflin helpless and snarling at once. "Get a patch, somebody. Fix up the hole." Joe, the mild one, growled. "Tiflin, me and my brother helped you. Now we're going to sit on you, just to make sure your funny business doesn't kill us all. Try anything just once, and we'll feed you all that vacuum without an Archer. If you're a good boy, maybe you'll live to get dumped on the moon as we pass by." "Nuts. Let's give this sick rat to the Space Force right now," Art Kuzak hissed. "Here comes their patrol bub." The glinting, transparent ring with the barred white star was passing at a distance. "All is well with you novices?" The inquiring voice was a gruff drawl, mingled with crunching sounds of eating, perhaps a candy bar. "No," Tiflin whispered, pleading. "I'll watch myself." The United Nations patrol was out too, farther off. Another darker bub, with other markings, passing by quite close. its foreign lines more than a bit sinister to the Bunch's first startled view. It was a Tovie vehicle, representing the other side of the still, for the most part, passively opposed forces on Earth and far beyond. But through the darkened transparency of stellene, the armored figures, again somewhat sinister, only raised their hands in greeting. In a minute Frank Nelsen emerged from Ramos's ring, floating free. He stabilized himself, fussed with the radio antenna of his helmet phone for a moment, making its transmission and reception directional. On the misty, shrinking Earth, North America was visible. "Frank Nelsen to Paul Hendricks," he said. "Frank Nelsen to Paul Hendricks." Paul was waiting all right. "Hello, Frankie. Some of the guys talked already. Said you were asleep." "Hi, Paul. Yeah. Terra still looks big and beautiful. We're okay. Amazing, isn't it? How just a few watts of power, beamed out in a thin thread, will reach this far and lots farther. Hey, will you open and shut your front door? Let's hear that old customer's bell jingle. Best to you, to J. John, to Nance Cottis, to Miss Parks, and everybody." The squeak of hinges and the jingling came through, clear and nostalgically. "Come on, Frank," Two and Two urged. Other guys would like to talk to Paul. "Hey, Paul, maybe you could get my folks down to the store to say hello to me on your transmitter. And I guess Les would appreciate it if you got his mother." When the talk got private, Frank went to Mitch Story's bub. "I wanted to show you," Mitch said. "I brought seeds and these little plastic tubes with holes in them that you can string around inside a bub. The weight is next to nothing. Put the seeds in the tubes and water with plant food in solution. The plants come up through the holes. Hydroponics. Gotta almost do it if I'm going way out to Mars without much supplies. Maybe before I get there I'll have even ripe tomatoes. 'Cause with sun all the time, the stuff grows like fury, they say. I'll have string beans and onions and flowers, anyhow. Helps keep the air oxygen fresh, too. Wish I had a few bumblebees, 'cause now I have to pollinate by hand." Nope, Mitch couldn't get away from vegetation, even in space. The Planet Strappers soon established a routine for their journey out as far as the Moon. There were watches to be sure that none of the bubs veered while somebody was asleep or inattentive. Always at hand were loaded rifles, because you never knew what kind of space-soured men, who might once have been as tame as neighbors going for a drive on Sundays with their families, might be around, even here. Neither Kuzak slept if the other wasn't awake. They were watching Tiflin, whose bub rode a little ahead of the others. He was ostracized, more or less. Everybody took to Ramos's kind of exercise, bouncing around inside a bub. Even Lester, who was calmer now, but obviously strained by the vast novelty and uncertainty ahead. "I gave you guys a hard time. I'm sorry," he apologized, "but I hope there won't be any more of that. The bunch will be breaking up soon, I guess, going here and there. And if I get a job at Serenitatis Base, I think I'll be okay." Frank Nelsen hoped that he could escape any further part of Lester, but he wasn't sure that he had the guts to desert him. It wasn't long before the ionics were shut off. Enough velocity had been attained. Soon the thrust would be needed in reverse for braking action near the end of the 60-hour journey into a circumlunar orbit. Sleep was a fitful, dream-haunted thing. Food was now mostly a kind of gruel, rich in starches, proteins, fats, and vitamins, each meal differently flavored, up to the number of 10 flavors, in a manufacturer's attempt to mask the sameness. Add water to a powder, heat, and eat. The spaceman's usual diet while afield. One of the functions of the moisture reclaimers was a rough joke, or a squeamishness. A man's kidneys and bowels functioned, and precious water molecules couldn't be wasted here in the dehydrated emptiness. But what difference did it really make after the sanitary distillation of a reclaimer? Except adjust. Decision about employment or activity in the immediate future was one thing that couldn't be dismissed, and announcements beamed from the Moon emphasized it. Serenitatis Base, 17th month, day 16th hour. There was a chime. Lunar Projects Placement is here to serve you. Plastics chemist, hydroponics specialist, machinists, mechanics, metallurgists, miners' helpers are all urgently needed. The tax-free pay will startle you. Free subsistence and quarters, here at Serene, at Tycho Station, or at a dozen other expanding sites. Charlie Reynolds sat with Frank Nelson while he listened. "The lady has a swell voice," said Charlie. "Otherwise it sounds good, too. But I'm one that's going farther, to Venus, just being explored, all fresh and no man-made booby traps, at least. Maybe they'll even figure out a way to make it rotate faster, give it a reasonably short day and a breathable atmosphere, make a warmer second Earth out of it. Sometimes, when you jump farther, you jump over a lot of trouble. Better than going slow with faint hearts. Their muddling misfortunes begin to stick to you. I'd rather be Mitch, headed for heebie-jeebie Mars, or the Kuzaks aiming for that crazy asteroid belt." That was Charlie talking to him, Frank Nelson, like an older brother. It made a sharp doubt in him again, but then he grinned. "Maybe I'm a slow starter," he said. "The moon is near and humble, but some say it's good training, even harsher than space, and I don't want to bypass and miss anything. Oh, hell, Charlie, I'll get farther soon, too, but I really don't even know what I'll do yet. Got to wait and see how the cards fall." Several hours before the rest of the bunch curved into a slow orbit 1,000 miles above the moon, Glen Tiflin set the ionic of his bub for full acceleration and arched away outward, perhaps toward the belt. "So long, all you dumb slobs," his voice hissed in their helmet phones. "Now I really get lost. If you ever cross my path again, watch your heads." Art Kuzak's flare of anger died. "Good riddance," he breathed. "How long will he last alone? Without a space fitness card, the poor idiot probably imagines himself a big, dangerous renegade already." Joe Kuzak's answering tone almost had a shrug in it. "Don't jinx our luck, twin brother," he said. "For that matter, how long will we last? Mex, did you toss Tiflin back his shiv?" "A couple of hours ago," Ramos answered mildly. Everybody was looking down at the moon, whose crater-pocked ugliness and beauty was sparsely dotted with the blue spots of stellene domes, many of them housing embryo enterprises that were trying to beat the blast-off cost of necessities brought from Earth and to supply spacemen and colonists with their needs cheaply. The 9 fragile rings were soon in orbit. One worker recruiting rocket and several trader rockets, much less powerful than those needed to achieve orbit around Earth, because lunar gravity was only 1/6 of the terrestrial, were floating in their midst. On the moon, it had of course been known that a fresh bunch was on the way. Even telescopes could have spotted them farther off than the distance of their 240,000-mile leap. Frank Nelson's tongue tasted of brassy doubt. He didn't know where he'd be, or what luck, good or bad, he might run into within the next hour. The Kuzaks were palavering with occupants of 2 heavily loaded trader rockets. "Sure we'll buy, if the price is right," Art was saying. "Flasks of water and oxygen, medicine, rolls of stellene, spare parts for Archies, ionics, air restorers, food, clothes, anything we can sell ourselves." The Kuzaks must have at least a few $1,000s, which they probably managed to borrow when they had gone home to Pennsylvania to say goodbye. Out here, free of the grip of any large sphere, there was hardly a limit to the load which their ionics could eventually accelerate sufficiently to travel tremendous distances. Streamlining in the vacuum, of course, wasn't necessary either. Now, a small, sharp-featured man in an Archie drifted close to Ramos and Frank as they floated near their bubs. "Hello, Ramos. Hello, Nelson," he said. "Yes, we know your names. We investigate beforehand, down on terra firma. We even have people to snap photographs. Often you don't even notice. We like guys with talent who get out here by their own efforts. Shows they've got guts, seriousness. But now you've arrived. We are Lunar Projects Placement. We need mechanics, process technicians, administrative personnel, anything you can name, almost. Any bright lad with drive enough to learn fast suits us fine. $500 an Earth week to start, meals and lodging thrown in. Quit any time you want. Plenty of different working sites, mines, refineries, factories, construction. Serenitatis Base? Ramos asked almost too quickly, Frank thought. And he sounded curiously serious. Was this the Ramos who should be going a lot further than the moon, anyway? "Hell yes, fella," said the job scout. "Then I'll sign." "Excellent. You too, guy?" The scout was looking at Frank. "And your other friends?" "I'm thinking about it," Frank answered cagily. "Some of them aren't stopping on the moon, as you can see." Mitch Storey was lashing a few flasks of oxygen and water to the rim of his bub, being careful to space them evenly for static balance. He didn't have the money to buy much more, even here. The Cusacks were preparing 2 huge bundles of supplies, which they intended to tow. Reynolds was also loading up a few things, with 2 and 2 helping him. "I'm all set, Frank," 2 and 2 shouted. "I'm going along with Charlie, maybe to crash the Venus exploration party." "Good," Frank shouted back, glad that this large, unsure person had found himself a leader. Now he looked at Gimp Hines, riding the spinning rim of his ring, with his good and bad leg dangling, an expectant, quizzical, half-worried look on his freckled face. But Dave Lester was more pathetic. He had stopped the rotation of his bub. He looked down first at the pitted, jagged face of the moon, with an expression in which rapture and terror may have been mingled, glanced with the hope of desperation toward the job scout, and then distractedly continued dismantling the rigging of his vehicle as if to repack it in the blast-off drum for a landing. "Hey, hold on, Les," 2 and 2 shouted. "You gotta know where you're going first." "Make up your mind, Nelson," said the job scout, getting impatient. "We handle just about everything lunar, except in the Tovie areas. Without us, you're just a lost, fresh punk." But another man had approached from another lunar GO rocket, which had just appeared. He had a thin, intellectual face, dark eyes, trap mouth, white hair, soft speech that was almost shy. "I'm Xavier Rodan," he said. "I search out my own employees. I do minerals survey for gypsum, bauxite, anything, and site survey for factories and other future developments. I also have connections with the Selenographic Institute of the University of Chicago. It is all interesting work, but in a rather remote region, I'm afraid, the far side of the moon, and I can pay only $300 a week. Of course, you can resign whenever you wish. Perhaps you'd be interested, Mr. Nelson, is it?" Frank had an impulse to jump at the chance, though there was a warning coming to him from somewhere. But how could you ever know? You would always have to go down to the Devil's Wilderness to find out. "I'll try it, Mr. Rodan," he said. "Selenography, that's one of my favorite subjects, sir," David Lester burst out, making a gingerly leap across the horrible void of spherical sky, stars in all directions except where the moon's bulk hung. "Could I, too?" His trembling mouth looked desperate. "Very well, boy," Rodan said at last. $100 for a week's work, period." Frank was glad that Lester had a place to go, and furious that he would probably have to nursemaid him after all. Gimp Hines kept riding the rim of his ring like a merry-go-round, his face trying to show casual humor and indifference over ruefulness and scare. "Nobody wants me," he said cheerfully. "It's just prejudice and poor imagination. Well, I don't think I'll even try to prove how good I am. Of course I could shoot for the asteroids, but I'd like to look around Serenitatis Base some, anyway. Will $50 get me and my rig down?" "Talk to our pilot, lame fella," said the job scout. "But you must be suicidal nuts to be around here at all." The others leapt to help Nelson, Ramos, Gimp, and Lester strip and pack their gear. Ramos's and Gimp's drums were loaded into the job scout's rocket. Nelson's and Lester's went into Rodan's. Gloved hands clasped gloved hands all around. The bunch, the Planet Strappers, were breaking up. "So long, you characters. See you around," said Art Kuzak. "It won't be 10 years before you all wind up in the Belt." "Bring back the Mystery of Mars, Mitch," Frank was saying. "When you get finished mooning, come to Venus, lover lad," Reynolds told Ramos. "But good luck." "Geez, I'm going to get sentimental," 2 and 2 moaned. "Luck, everybody. Come on, Charlie, let's roll. I don't want the slobber." "I'll catch up with you all. Watch," Gimp promised. "So long, Frank." "Yeah, over the Milky Way, Frankie." "Hasta luego, gang." That was all Ramos, the big mouth, had to say. He wasn't glum exactly, but he was sort of preoccupied and impatient. The 5 remaining rings, a wonderful sight, Frank thought, began to move out of orbit. Ships with sails set for far ports. No, mere ships of the sea were nothing anymore. But would all of the bunch survive? Charlie Reynolds, the cool one, the most likely to succeed, waved jauntily and carelessly from his rotating, accelerating ring. 2 and 2 wagged both arms stiffly from his. Mitch Story's bub, lightest loaded, was jumping ahead, but you could hear him playing Old Man River on his mouth organ inside his helmet. The Kuzak's bubs, towing massive loads, were accelerating slowest, with the ex-Gridiron twins riding the rigging. But their rings would dwindle to star specks before long, too. The Job Scout's rocket carrying Ramos and Gimp began to flame for a landing at Serene. In the airtight cabin of Xavier Rodan's vehicle, Frank Nelson and David Lester had read and signed their contracts and had received their copies. Rodan didn't smile. "Now we'll go down and have a look at the place I'm investigating," he said. End of Chapter 3, Part 2. Part 1 of The Planet Strappers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Planet Strappers by Raymond Z. Gallun. Chapter 4, Part 1. Frank Nelson's view of Empire building on the Moon was brief, all-encompassing, and far too sketchy to be very satisfying, as Rodan turned about in his universal gimbaled pilot's seat, spiraled his battered rocket down backwards, with the small nuclear jets firing forward in jerky, tooth-cracking bursts to check speed further. It was necessary to go around the abortive sub-planet that had always accompanied the Earth almost once to reduce velocity enough for a landing. Thus Nelson glimpsed much territory. The splashed, irregular shape of Sarantitis, the international base on the Mare, the dust sea of the same name, the radiating threads of trails and embryo highways, the ever-widening separation of isolated domes and scattered human diggings and workings fairly scratched in the lunar crust, as, at a still great height, Frank's gaze swept outward from the greatest center of human endeavor on the Moon. It was much the same around Tycho Station, except that this base was smaller, and was built in a great, white-rayed crater whose walls were pierced by tunnels for exit and entry. The Tovey camp, glimpsed later and only at the distant horizon, seemed not very different from the others, except for the misleading patterns of camouflage. That the Toveys should have an exclusive center of their own was not even legal according to UN agreements. But facts were facts, and what did anyone do about them? Frank was not very concerned with such issues just then, for there was an impression that was overpowering: the slightness of the intrusion of his kind on a 2,000-something mile in diameter globe of incredible desert, overlapping ring walls, craters centered in radiating streaks of white ash, mountain ranges that sank gradually into dust, which once, 2 billion years ago, after probable ejection from volcanoes, had no doubt floated in a then palpable atmosphere. But now, to a lone man down there, they would be bleak plains stretching to a disconcertingly near horizon. Frank Nelson's view was one of fascination, behind which was the chilly thought: this is my choice. Here is where I will have to live for a short while that can seem ages. Space looks tame now. Can I make it all right? Worse, how about Lester?" Frank looked around him. Like Rodan, Lester and he had both pivoted around in their gimbaled seats, to which they had safety strapped themselves, to face the now forward-pointing stern jets. Rodan, looking more trap-mouthed than before, had said nothing further as he guided the craft gingerly lower. Lester was biting his heavy lip. His narrow chin trembled. A faint whisper had begun. As far back as the 1940s, astronomers had begun to suspect that the Moon was, after all, not entirely airless. There would be traces of heavy gases, argon, neon, xenon, krypton, and volcanic carbon dioxide. It would be expanded far upward above the surface, because the feeble lunar gravity could not give it sufficient weight to compress it very much. So it would thin out much less rapidly with altitude than does the terrestrial atmosphere. From a density of perhaps 1/12,000th of Earth's sea level norm at the Moon's surface, it would thin to perhaps 1/20,000th at a height of 80 miles, being thus roughly equivalent in density to Earth's gaseous envelope at the same level. And at this height was the terrestrial zone where meteors flare. This theory about the lunar atmosphere had proven to be correct. The tiny density was sufficient to give the Moon almost as effective an atmospheric meteor screen as the Earth's. The relatively low velocity needed to maintain vehicles in circumlunar orbits made its danger to such vehicles small. It could help reduce speed for a landing. It caused that innocuous hiss of passage. But it could sometimes be treacherous. Frank thought of these things as the long minutes dragged. Perhaps Rodan, hunched intently over his controls, had reason enough there to be silent. The actual landing still had to be made in the only way possible on worlds whose air covering was so close to a complete vacuum as this, like a cat climbing down a tree backwards. With flaming jets still holding it up, and spinning gyros keeping it vertical, the rocket lowered gradually. The seats swung level, keeping their occupants right side up. There was a hovering pause, then the faint jolt of contact. The jet growls stopped. Complete silence closed in like a hammer blow. "Do you men know where you are?" Rodan asked after a moment. "At the edge of Mare Nova, I think," Frank answered, his eyes combing the demon's landscape beyond the thick, darkened glass of the cabin's ports. The dazzling sun was low, early morning of 2 weeks of daylight. The shadows were long, black shafts. "Yes, there's Tower Rock," Lester quavered, "and the Arabian Range going down under the dust of the plain." "Correct," Rodan answered. "We're well over the rim of the far side. You'll never see the Earth from here. The nearest settlement is 800 miles away, and it's Tovie at that. This is a really remote spot, as I intimated before." He paused, as if to let this significant information be appreciated. "So that's settled," he went on. "Now, I'll enlighten you about what else you need to know. Come along." Frank Nelsen felt the dust crunch under the rubberized boot soles of his Archer. There was a brief walk, then a pause. Rodan pointed to a pit dynamited out of the dust and lava rock, and to small piles of grayish material beside 6-inch borings rectangularly spaced over a wide area. "There is an extensive underlying layer of gypsum here," he said, "the water-bearing rock. A mile away there's an ample deposit of graphite, carbon. Thus there exists a complete local source of hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon, ideal for synthesizing various hydrocarbonic chemicals or making complicated polyethylene materials such as stellene, so useful in space. Lead, too, is not very far off. Silicon is, of course, available everywhere. There'll be a plant belonging to Hoffman Chemicals here before too long. I was prospecting for them for a site like this. Actually, I was very lucky, locating this spot almost right away, which is fortunate. They think I'm still looking and aren't concerned." Rodan was quiet for a moment before continuing. The pupils of his eyes dilated and contracted strangely. "Because I found something else," he went on. "It was luck beyond dreams, and it must be my very own. I intend to investigate it thoroughly, even if it takes years. Come along again." This time the walk was about 300 yards, past 3 small stellene domes, the parabolic mirrors of a solar-powered plant, a sun-energized tractor, and onward almost to the mountain wall, embedded in the dust of the mare. There Frank noticed a circular, glassy area. Strips of magnesium were laid like bridging planks across chunks of lava, and in the dust all around were countless curious scrabbled marks. Rodan stood carefully on a magnesium strip and looked back at Nelsen and Lester, his brows crinkling as if he was suspicious that he had already told them too much. Frank Nelsen became more aware of the heavy automatic pistol at Rodan's hip, and felt a tingling urge to get away from here and from this man, as if a vast mistake had been made. "It is necessary for you to be informed about some matters," Rodan said slowly. "For instance, unless it is otherwise disturbed, a footprint, or the like, will endure for millions of years on the Moon, as surely as if impressed in granite, because there is no weather left to rub it out. You will be working here. I am preserving some of these markings, so please walk on these strips, which Dutch and I have laid down." Rodan indicated a large, archer-clad man who also carried an automatic. He had the face of a playful but dangerous mastiff. He was hunkered down in a shallow pit, scanning the ground with a watch-sized device probably intended for locating objects hidden just beneath the surface, electronically. Beside him was a screen-bottomed container, no doubt meant for sifting dust. "Greetings, novices," he gruffed with genial contempt. But his pale eyes, beyond the curve of his helmet, had a masked puzzlement, as if something from the lunar desolation had gotten into his brain, leaving the realization of where he was, permanently not altogether clear to him. Rodan pulled a shiny object from his thigh pouch and held it out in a gloved palm for his new employees to peer at. "One of the things we found," he remarked. "Incomplete. If we could, for instance, locate the other parts..." Frank saw a little cylinder, with gray coils wrapped inside it. A power chamber, perhaps, to be lined with magnetic force, the only thing that could contain what amounted to a tiny 20-million-degree piece of a star's hot heart. It was a familiar principle for releasing and managing nuclear power. But the device, perhaps part of a small weapon, was subtly marked by the differences of another technology. "I believe I have said enough," Rodan stated with a thin smile, "though some facts will be unavoidably obvious to you, working here. But at least I will let you figure them out for yourselves, since you are well-informed young men, by your own statement." Here Rodan looked hard at the pale, unsteady Lester. "We will go back, now, so I can show you the camp, its routine, and your place in it. We have 3 domes, garden and living quarters, with a workshop and supply dome between them. Quarters proved to be okay. 2 bunks and the usual compact accessories. "Leave your Archers in the lockers outside your door. Here are your keys," Rodan suggested. "Helen will have a meal ready for you in the adjacent dining room. Afterwards, take a helpful tranquilizer and sleep. No work until you awaken. I shall leave you now." It was a good meal, steak cultured and grown in a nourishing solution on the Moon, perhaps at Serene, much as Dr. Alexis Carrel had long ago grown and kept for years a living fragment of a chicken's heart. Potatoes, peas and tomatoes, too. All had become common staples in hydroponic gardens off the Earth. "What do you make of what Rodan was talking about, Les?" Frank asked conversationally. But David Lester was lost and vague, his food almost untouched. I don't know," he stammered. Scared and embittered further by this bad sign, Frank turned to Helen. "And how are you?" he asked hopefully. "I'm all right," she answered, without a trace of encouragement. She was in jeans. Maybe she was 18. Maybe she was Rodan's daughter. Her face was as reddened as a peasant's. It was hard to tell that she was a girl at all. She wasn't a girl. It was soon plain that she was a zombie with about 10 words in her vocabulary. How could a girl have gotten to this impossible region, anyway? Now Frank tried to delay Lester's inevitable complete crack-up by encouraging his interest in their situation. "It's big, Les," he said. "It's got to be. An expedition came here to investigate the moon. It couldn't be any more recently than 60 million years ago, if it was from as close as Mars or the asteroid planet. 2 adjacent worlds were competing then, the scientists know. Both were smaller than Earth, cooled faster, bore life sooner. Which sent the party? I saw where their rocket ship must have stood, a glassy spot where the dust was once fused. From all the markings, they must have been around for months. Nowhere else on the moon that I ever heard of is there anything similar left. So maybe they did most of their survey work by gliding somehow above the ground, not disturbing the dust. I think the little indentations we saw look Martian. That would be a break. Mars still has weather. Archaeological objects wouldn't stay new there for millions of years, but here they would. Rodan is right. He's got something that'll make him famous." "Yes, I think I'll have a devil killer and hit the sack, Frank," Lester said. "Oh, all right," Frank agreed wearily. "Me likewise." Frank awoke naturally from a dreamless slumber. After a breakfast of eggs that had been a powder, Lester and he were at the diggings, sifting dust for the dropped and discarded items of an alien visitation. Thus Frank's job began. In the excitement of a hunt, as if for ancient treasure, for a long time, through many 10-hour shifts, Frank Nelsen found perhaps unfortunate lethe of forgetfulness for his worries, and for the mind-poisoning effects of the silence and desolation in this remote part of the moon. They found things, thinly scattered in the 10-acre area that Rodan meant tediously to sift. The screws and nuts, bright and new, were almost earthly, but would anyone ever know what the little plastic rings were for, or the sticks of cellulose, or the curved wire device with fuzz at the ends? But then, would an off-Earth being ever guess the use of, say, a toothbrush or a bobby pin? The metal cylinders, neatly cut open, might have contained food. Dried, leaf-like dregs still remained inside. There were small bottles made of pearly glass, too, empty except for gummy traces. They were stoppered with a stuff like rubber. There was also crumpled scraps, like paper or cellophane, most of them marked with designs or symbols. After 10 Earth days, in the lunar afternoon, Frank found the grave. He shouted as his brushing hands uncovered a glassy, flexible surface. Rodan took charge at once. "Back," he commanded. Then he was avidly busy in the pit, working as carefully as a fine jeweler. He cleared more dust away, not with a trowel, not with his gloved fingers, but with a little nylon brush. The thing was like a 7-pointed star, 4 feet across. And was the ripped, transparent casing of its body and limbs another version of a vacuum armor? The material resembled stellene. As in an Archer, there were metal details, mechanical, electronic, and perhaps nuclear. In the punctured covering, the corpse was dry, of course. Stomach, brain sac, rough, pitted skin, terminal tendrils, some coarse, some fine, almost as thread for doing the most delicate work, half out of protecting sheaths at the end of its arms or legs. In the armor, the being must have walked like a toe dancer on metal spikes, or it might have even rolled like a wheel. The bluish tint of its crusty body was half faded to tan. Perhaps no one would ever explain the gaping wound that must have killed the creature, unless it had been a rock fall. "Martian," Lester gasped. "At least we know they were like this." "Yes," Rodan agreed softly. "I'll look after this find." Moving very carefully, even in the weak lunar gravity, He picked up the product of another evolution and bore it away to the shop dome. Frank was furious. This was his discovery, and he was not even allowed to examine it. Still, something warned him not to argue. In a little while his treasure hunter's eagerness came back, holding out through most of that protracted lunar night when they worked their 10-hour periods with electric lamps attached to their shoulders. But gradually Frank began to emerge from his single line of attention. Knowing that Lester must soon collapse, and waiting tensely for it to happen, was part of the cause. But there was much more. There was the fact that direct radio communication with the Earth around the curve of the Moon was impossible. The Tovies didn't like radio relay orbiters, useful for beamed short-wave messages. They had destroyed the few unmanned ones that had been put up. There were several times when he casually sent a slender beam of radio energy groping out towards Mars and the asteroid belt, trying to call Story or the Kuzaks, and had received no answer. Well, this was not remarkable. Those regions were enormous beyond imagining. You had to pinpoint your thread of tiny energy almost precisely. But once, for an instant while at work, he heard a voice which could be Mitch Story call, "Frank, Frankie," in his helmet phone. There was no chance for him to get an instrument fix on the direction of the incoming waves. And of course his name, Frank, was a common one. But an immediate attempt to beam Mars yellow in the black sky and its vicinity produced no result. His trapped feelings increased, and nostalgia began to bore into him. He had memories of lost sounds. Rodan tried to combat the thick silence with taped popular music, broadcast on a very low power from a field set at the diggings. But the girls' voices, singing richly, only made matters worse for Frank Nelsen. And other memories piled up on him. Jarviston, Minnesota, wind, hay smell, car smell, home, cripes, damn. Lester's habit of muttering unintelligibly to himself was much worse now. Frank was expecting him to start screaming at any minute. Frank hadn't tried to talk to him much, and Lester, more introverted than ever, was no starter of conversations. But now, at the sunrise, S.O.B., was it possible that they had been here almost a month? Frank, at the diggings, indulged in some muttering himself. "Are you all right, Frank?" Lester asked mildly. "Not altogether," Frank Nelsen snapped dryly. "How about you?" "Oh, I believe I'm okay at last," Lester replied with startling brightness. "I was afraid I wouldn't be. I guess I had an inferiority complex, and there was also something to live up to. You see, my dad was here with the original Clifford expedition. We always agreed that I should become a space scientist, too. Mom went along with that, until Dad was killed. Here, well, I'm over the hump now. You see, I'm so interested in everything around me that the desolation has a cushion of romance that protects me. I don't just see the bleakness. I imagine the moon as it once was, with volcanoes spitting and with thunderous sounds in its steamy atmosphere. I see it when the Martians were here. They surely visited Earth, too, though there all evidence weathered away. I even see the moon as it is now, noticing the details that are easy to miss. The little balls of ash that got stuck together by raindrops 2 billion years ago, and the pulpy, hard-shelled plants that you can still find alive if you know where to look. There are some up on the ridge where I often go when off shift. Carbon dioxide and a little water vapor must still come out of the deep crack there. Anyhow, they used to say that a lonesome person, with perhaps a touch of schizophrenia, might do better off the Earth than the more usual types. Frank Nelsen was surprised as much by this open, self-analytical explanation, and the clearing up of the family history behind him, as by the miracle that had happened. Cripes, was it possible that, in his own way, Lester was more rugged than anybody else of the old bunch? Of course, even Lester was somewhat in wonder himself, and had to talk it all out to somebody. "Good for you, Les," Nelsen enthused, relieved. "Only, well, skip it for now." 2 work periods later he approached Rodan. "It will take months to sift all this dust," he said. "I may not want to stay that long." The pupils of Rodan's eyes flickered again. "Oh," he said. "Per contract you can quit any time. But I provide no transportation. Do you want to walk 800 miles to a Tovian station? On the Moon it is difficult to keep hired help, so one must rely on practical counter circumstances. Besides, I wouldn't want you to be at Serenitatis Base or anywhere else talking about my discovery. Nelsen, I'm afraid you're stuck." Now Nelsen had the result of his perhaps incautious test statement. He knew that he was trapped by a dangerous tyrant such as might spring up in any new, lawless country. "It was just a thought, sir," he said, being as placating as he dared, and controlling his rising fury. For there was something that hardened too quickly in Rodan. He had the fame and glory bug, and could be savage about it. If you wanted to get away, you had to scheme by yourself. There wasn't only Rodan to get past. There was Dutch, the big ape with the dangling pistol. Nelsen decided to work quietly as before for a while. There were a few more significant finds. What might have been a nuclear-operated clock, broken of course, and some diamond drill bits. Though the long lunar day dragged intolerably, there was the paradox of time seeming to escape, too. Daylight ended with the sunset. 2 weeks of darkness was no period for any moves. At sunup a second month was almost finished, and 10 acres of dust was less than half sifted. In the shop and supply dome, David Lester had been chemically analyzing the dregs of various Martian containers for Rodan. In spare moments, he classified those scarce and incredibly hardy lunar growths that he had found in the foothills of the Arabian Range. Some had hard, bright green tendrils that during daylight opened out of woody shells full of spongy hollows as an insulation against the fearsome cold of night. Some were so small that they could only be seen under a microscope. Frank's interest here, however, palled quickly, and Lester, in his mumbling, studious preoccupation, was no companionable antidote for loneliness. Frank tried a new approach on Helen, who really was Rodan's daughter. "Do you like poetry, Helen? I used to memorize Keats, Frost, Shakespeare." They were there in the dining room. She brightened a little. "I remember some." "Do you remember clouds, the sound of water, trees, grass?" She actually smiled wistfully. "Yes, Sunday afternoons, a blue dress, my mother when she was alive, a dog I had once." Helen Rodan wasn't quite a zombie after all. Maybe he could win her confidence if he went slow. But 20 hours later at the diggings, when Dutch stumbled over Frank's sifter, she reverted. "I'll learn you to leave junk in my way, you greenhorn squirt!" Dutch shouted. Then he tossed Frank 30 feet. Frank came back, kicked him in his thinly armored stomach, knocked him down, and tried to get his gun. But Dutch grabbed him with those big arms. Helen was also pointing a small pistol at him. She was trembling. "Dad will handle this," she said. Rodan came over. "You don't have much choice, do you, Nelsen?" he sneered. However, perhaps Dutch was crude. "I apologize for him, and I will deduct $100 from his pay and give it to you." "Much obliged," Frank said dryly. After that, everything happened to build his tensions to the breaking point. At a work period's end near the lunar noon, he heard a voice in his helmet phone. "Frank, this is 2 and 2. Why don't you ever call or answer?" 2 and 2's usually plaintive voice had a special quality, as if he was maybe in trouble. This time Frank got a directional fix, adjusted his antenna, and called, "Hey, 2 and 2. Hey, pal, it's me, Frank Nelsen." Venus was in the sky, not too close to the sun. But still, though Nelsen called repeatedly, there was no reply. He got back to quarters and looked over not only his radio, but his entire Archer. The radio had been fiddled with, delicately. It would still work, but not in a narrow enough beam to reach millions of miles, or even 500. An intricate focusing device had been removed from a wave guide. That wasn't the worst that was wrong with the Archer. The small nuclear battery which energized the moisture reclaimer, the heating units, and especially the air restorer, not only for turning its pump, but for providing the intense internal illumination necessary to promote the release of oxygen in the photosynthetic process of the chlorophane when there was no sun, had been replaced by a chemical battery of a far smaller active lifespan. The armor locker. Rodan had extra keys and could tamper and make replacements at any time he considered it necessary. Lester had wandered afield somewhere. When he showed up, Nelsen jarred him out of his studious preoccupations long enough for them both to examine his armor. Same identical story. Rodan made sure, Frank gruffed. That SOB put us on a real short tether. David Lester looked frightened for a minute. Then he seemed to ease. "Maybe it doesn't make any difference," he said. "Though I'd like to call my mother. But I'm doing things I like. After a while, when the job is finished, he'll let us go." "Yeah," Frank breathed. There was the big question. Nelsen figured that an old, corny pattern stuck out all over Rodan. Personal glory emphasized to a point where it got beyond sense. And wouldn't that unreason be more likely to get worse in the terrible lunar desert than it ever would on Earth? Would Rodan ever release them? Wouldn't he fear encroachment on his archaeological success, even after all his data had been made public? This was all surmise prediction, of course, but his extreme precautions already taken did not look good. On the Moon, there could easily be an arranged accident, killing Lester and him, Frank Nelsen, and maybe even Dutch. Rodan's pupils had that nervous way of expanding and contracting rapidly, too. Nelsen figured that he might be reading the signs somewhat warpedly himself. Still... At the end of another shift, Nelsen took a walk, farther than ever before, up through a twisted pass that penetrated to the other side of the Arabian Mountains. He still had that much freedom. He wanted to think things out. In bitter, frustrating reversal of all his former urges to get off the Earth, he wanted, like a desperate weakling, to be back home. Up beyond the Arabians, he saw the tread marks of a small tractor vehicle in a patch of dust. There was a single boot print. A short distance further on, there was another. He examined them with a quizzical excitement, but there weren't any more. For miles ahead and behind, unimpressible lava rock extended. Another curious thing happened only minutes later. 1,000 miles overhead, out of reach of his sabotaged transmitter, one of those around the Moon tour bubs, like the unfortunate Far Side, was passing. He heard the program they were broadcasting. A male voice crooned out what must be a new, popular song. He had heard so few new songs. "Serene, found a queen, her name is Eileen." Nelsen's reaction wasn't even a thought at first. It was only an eerie tingle in all his flesh. Then, realizing what his suspicion was, he listened further, with all his nerves taut. But no explanation of the song's origin was given. He even tried futilely to radio the pleasure bub, full of Earth tourists. In minutes it had sunk behind the abrupt horizon, leaving him with his unanswered wonder. Girls, he thought, in the midst of his utter solitude. All girls to love and have. Eileen? Cripes! Could it be little old Eileen Sands, up on her ballet dancing toes sometimes at Hendricks, and humming herself a tune? Eileen, who had deserted the bunch, meaning to approach space in a feminine way. Holy cow! Had even she gotten that far, so fast? Suddenly the possibility became a symbol of what the others of the bunch must be accomplishing, while here he was, trapped, stuck futilely inside a few bleak square miles on the far side of Earth's own satellite. So here was another force of Frank Nelsen's desperation. He made up his mind, which perhaps just then was a bit mad. With outward calm, he returned to camp, slept, worked, slept and worked again. He decided that there was no help to be had from Lester, who was still no man of action. Better to work alone anyway. Fortunately, on the Moon, it was easy to call deadly forces to one's aid. Something as simple as possible, the trick should be. Of course, all he wanted to do was to get the upper hand on Rodan and Dutch, take over the camp, get the missing parts of his radio and Archer, borrow the solar tractor, and get out of here. To Serenitatis Base, serene. His only preparation was to sharpen the edges of a diamond-shaped trowel used at the diggings, with a piece of pumice. Then he waited. End of Chapter 4, Part 1. Part 2 of The Planet Strappers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Planet Strappers by Raymond Z. Gallun. Chapter 4, Part 2. Opportunity came near sundown, after a shift. Rodan, Dutch, and he had come into the supply and shop dome through its airlock. Lester and Helen, these two introverts, had somehow discovered each other and were getting along well together, were visible through the transparent wall, lingering at the diggings. Nelsen saw Rodan and Dutch unlatch the collars of their helmets, preparatory for removing them, as they usually did, if they stayed here a while, to pack new artifacts or stow tools. Nelsen made as if to unlatch his collar too. But if he did it, the gasket would be unsealed and his helmet would no longer be airtight. Now, he told himself. Or would it be better to wait 14 more Earth days till another lunar dawn? Hell no. That would be chickenish procrastination. Rodan and Dutch were a good 10 feet away from him. He was out of their reach. With the harmless-looking trowel he held like a dagger, he struck with all his might at the stellene outer wall of the dome, and then made a ripping motion. Like a monster gasping for breath, the imprisoned air sighed out. Taking advantage of the moment when Rodan's and Dutch's hands moved in life-saving instinct to reseal their collars, Frank Nelsen leaped, and then kicked twice as hard as he could in rapid succession, at Dutch's stomach first, then Rodan's. They were down, safe from death, since they had managed to relatch their collars. But with a cold fury that had learned to take no chances with defeat, Nelsen proceeded to kick them again, first one and then the other, meaning to make them insensible. He got Dutch's pistol. He was a shade slow with Rodan. "You won't get anything that is mine," he heard Rodan grunt. Frank managed to deflect the automatic's muzzle from himself, but Rodan moved it downward purposefully, lined it up on a box marked dynamite, and fired. Nelsen must have thrown himself prone at the last instant, before the ticklish explosive blew. He saw the flash and felt the dazing thud, though most of the blast passed over him. Results far outstripped the most furious intention of his plan, and became not freedom, but a threat of slow dying, an ordeal, as the sagging dome was torn from above him, and supplies, air restorer equipment, water and oxygen flasks, the vitals and the batteries of the solar electric plant, all for the most part hopelessly shattered, were hurled far and wide, along with the relics from Mars. The adjacent garden and quarters domes were also shredded and swept away. Dazed, Nelsen still got Rodan's automatic, picked himself up, saw that Dutch and Rodan, in armor, too, had apparently suffered from the explosion no worse than he had. He glanced at the hole in the lava rock, still smoking in the high vacuum. Most of the force of the blast had gone upward. He looked at Helen's toppled tomatoes and petunias. Yes, petunias, where the garden dome had been. Oddly, they didn't wilt at once, though the little water in the hydroponic troughs was boiling away furiously, making frosty rainbows in the slanting light of the sun. Fragments of a solar lamp, to keep the plants growing at night, lay in the shambles. Rodan and Dutch were pretty well knocked out from Frank Nelson's footwork. Now Dave Lester and Helen Rodan came running. Lester's face was all stunned surprise. Helen was yelling, "I saw you do it, you murderer!" When she kneeled beside her father, Frank got her gun too. He felt an awful regret for a plan whose results far surpassed his intentions, but there was no good in showing it now. Someone had to be in command in a situation which already looked black. "Frank, I didn't suppose," Lester stammered. "Now, what are we going to do?" "All that we can do. Try to get out of here," Frank snapped back at him. With some shreds of stellene, he tied Dutch's arms behind his back and lashed his feet together. Then he pulled Helen away from Rodan. "Hold her, Les," he ordered. "Maybe I overplayed my hand, but just the same, I still think I'm the best to say what's to be done and maybe get us out of a jam. And I can't have Helen or Rodan or anybody else doing any more cockeyed things to screw matters up even worse than they are." Nelson trussed Rodan up, too, then searched Rodan's thigh pouch and found a bunch of keys. "You come along with me, Les and Helen," he said. "First, we'll find out what we've got left to work with." He investigated the rocket. That the blast had toppled it over wasn't the worst. When he unlocked its servicing doors, he found that Rodan had removed a vital part from the nuclear exciters of the motors. His and Lester's blast-off drums were still in the freight compartment, but the ionics and air restorers had been similarly rendered unworkable. Their oxygen and water flasks were gone. Only their bubs were intact, but there was nothing with which to inflate them. When Frank examined the sun-powered tractor, he found that tiny platinum plates had been taken from the thermocouple units. It was clear that, with paranoid thoroughness, Rodan had concentrated all capacity to move from the camp's vicinity in himself. He had probably locked up the missing items in the supply dome, and now the exploding dynamite had ruined them. Exploring the plane, Nelson even found quite a few of the absent parts, all useless. Only one oxygen flask and one water flask remained intact. Here was a diabolical backfiring of schemes all around. Returning to Rodan and Dutch, he examined their Archers through their servicing ports. Rodan's was as the manufacturer intended it, but Dutch's was jimmied the same as his and Lester's. Nelson swung Helen around to face him and unlatched the port at her Archer's shoulder. "He put even you on a short string, kid," he pronounced bitterly, after a moment. "Well, at least we can give you his nuclear battery for a while, and let him have his chemical cell back." Helen seemed about to attack him, but then her look wavered. Confusion and pain came into her face. Nelson was aware that he was doing almost all of the talking, but maybe this had to be. "So we've got a long walk," he said, "towards the Toby settlement, in Archers of mostly much reduced range. Whose fault this situation is, can't change anything a bit. This is a life or death proposition, with lasting time the most important factor. So let's get started. Has anybody got any suggestions to increase our chances?" Both Rodan and Dutch had come to. Rodan said nothing. His look was pure poison. Dutch sneered. "Smart damn kid you are, huh, Nelson? You think. Wait till you and your mumbling crackpot pal get out there. I'll watch both of you go bust, squirt." Lester seemed not to hear these remarks. "All that gypsum, Frank," he said. "The water and oxygen mineral. But this is for real. There's no gimmick, no energy source to release it and save us." Frank Nelson untied Rodan's and Dutch's feet, and at pistol point ordered them to move out ahead. From the charts he knew the bearing, straight toward the constellation Cassiopeia, at this hour, across an arm of Mare Nova, then along a pass that cut through the mountains. 800 hopeless miles. Well, how did he know, really? How much could a human body take? How fast could they go? How long would the chemical batteries actually last? What breaks might appear? They loped along, even Rodan hurrying. They made 100 miles in the hours before darkness. With just Helen's shoulder lamp showing the way, they continued onward through the mountains. Was there truly much to tell in that slow, losing struggle? Nelsen attached the oxygen flask to his air system for a while, relieving the drain on his battery. Then he gave the flask to Lester. Later, he began to move the nuclear battery around to all the Archers, to conserve all of the other batteries a little. Soon, they filled the drinking water tanks of their armor, so that they could discard the flask, whose slight weight seemed to have tripled. After 20 hours, the power of the chemical batteries began to wane. David Lester, hovering close to Helen, muttered to himself or to her. Rodan, still marching quite strongly, retreated into an unreality of his own. "Have another scotch on the rocks, Ralph," he said genially. "I knew I'd make it. Nobel Prize. Oh, you have no idea what I went through. Most of my staff dead. But it's over now, Ralph. Another good stomach-warming scotch." "Damn loony squirt's cracking up," Dutch screamed suddenly. He began to run, promptly falling into a volcanic crack, the bottom of which couldn't even be found with the light. Fortunately, he wasn't wearing the nuclear battery just then. Somehow Lester remained cool. It was as if, with everyone else scared too, and nobody to show superior courage, he had found himself. The batteries waned further. The cold of the inky lunar night, much worse than that of interplanetary space, where there is practically always sunshine, began to bite through the insulation of the Archers, and power couldn't be wasted on the heating coils. Worse was the need for rest. They all lay down at last, except Frank Nelsen, who moved around, clipping the nuclear battery into one Archer for a minute to freshen the air, and then into another. It was the only trick or gimmick that they found. After a while, Lester made the rounds, while Nelsen rested. They got a few more miles by swapping batteries in quick succession, but the accumulating carbon dioxide in the air they breathed made them sleepier. They had to sit down, then lie down. Frank figured that they had come something over a quarter of the 800 miles. This was about the end of Frank Nelsen, would-be planet strapper from Jarviston, Minnesota. Well, his coffin would be a common one, an Archer 5. Somehow he thought of a line from Kipling. "If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you." He tried to clip the nuclear battery back into Helen's armor again. She might make the remaining 500-something miles alone. He just barely managed to accomplish it. There was still a little juice from his chemical cell feeding his helmet phone. Now he thought he heard someone singing raucously, one of those improvised doggerel songs of spacemen and moonmen. Folklore, almost. "If this goddamn dust just holds its crust, I'll get on to hell if my gear don't bust." "Hey!" Nelsen gurgled thickly into his phone. "Hey!" Then it was as if he sort of sank. Hell was real, all right, because with needles in his eyes and all through his body, Nelsen seemed to be goaded on by imps to crawl in infinite weariness through a hot steel pipe to face old Nick himself. Or was it somebody he met before? Maybe, he asked, because he got an answer from the grinning, freckled face bending over him as he lay armorless on a sort of pallet under the taunt-stelling roof of a moon tent. "Sure, Frankie, me, Gimp Hines, the itinerant trader and repairman of the lunar wilderness. What a switch. Didn't think you'd goof. The bunch, especially 2 and 2, couldn't contact you, so I was sort of looking, knowing about where you'd be. Just made it in time. Les and the girl and that ornery professor or whatever are right here, too, still knocked out with a devil killer. You've been out 20 hours yourself. I'll fill you in on the news. Just shut up and drink up. Good Earth whiskey. $100 just to shoot a fifth into orbit." Frank gulped and coughed. "Thanks, Gimp." His voice was like pumice. "Shut up, I said," Gimp ordered arrogantly. "About me, first. When I got to Serene, I could have convinced them that I was worth a job. But I'm independent. I hocked my gear, bought some old parts, built myself a tractor and trailer, loaded it with water, oxygen, frozen vegetables, spare parts, cigarettes, pin-up pictures, liquor, and so forth, and came traveling. I didn't forget tools. You'd be astonished by what you can sell and fix, and for what prices, out in the isolated areas, or what you can bring back. I even got a couple of emeralds as big as pigeon eggs. I'm getting myself a reputation besides. What difference does just one good leg make, at only 1/6 Earth grav? You'd still hop along, even when you don't ride, and everywhere I go, I leave the left boot print behind in the dust, like a record that could last 1,000 ages. I'm getting to be left foot, the legend. Nelsen cleared his throat, found his voice. Cocky, aren't you, pal? He chuckled. So another thing was happening in reverse from what most people had expected. Gimp Hines was finding a new, surer self off the Earth. It's all right, Gimp, Nelsen added. I figured that I saw your tracks and your tractor tread marks up in the hills just before I decided to break away from Rodan. Then he was telling the whole story. Yes, I was there, Gimp said at the end. I missed you on the first pass, prospected for a couple of Earth days, found a small copper deposit. High ground gave me a good position to receive short-wave messages. Thought I heard your voices a couple times, so I doubled back and located what is left of Rodan's camp and yours and Les's initialed blast-off drums, which I've brought along in my trailer. Lucky. A trader needs an atom-powered tractor that can move at night. I followed your tracks, though going through rough country, you were screened from my radio calls until I was almost on you. Though on my first pass, when you were still in camp, I guess, I could have reached you by bouncing a beam off a mountaintop had I known. Well, it doesn't matter now. I'm out of stock again and full of money. Got to head back to Serene. You were trying for the Tovey station, huh? What else could we do? I see what you mean, Frank. If you could have made it and missed getting shot by some trigger-happy guard, where a frontier isn't even supposed to exist, they probably would have held you for a while and then let you go. About the rest of the bunch, Frank, Nelsen prompted. The Kuzaks got to the belt okay, though they had to fight off some rough and humorous characters. Story reached his Mars. Charlie Reynolds and Two got to Venus and hooked up with the exploring expedition. Tiflin, who knows? Ramos. Ah, a real disappointing case, Frank. Darn wild idiot, who ought to be probing the farther reaches of the solar system, got himself a job in a chemical plant in Serene. A synthesizing retort exploded. He was burned pretty bad, just out of the hospital when I last left. It was on account of a woman that he was on the Moon at all. Eileen, the Queen of Serene, Gimp? Is that so, too? Yep, sort of. Our Eileen. Back in Jarviston, Ramos found out that she was there. She's a good kid. Even admits that she hasn't got much competition on a mostly yet masculine world. Well, I guess we start rolling, huh? I didn't want to jolt any of you poor sick people, so I camped. Let's get you all into Archers, for which I have a few spare parts left. Then, after we roll up the sealed air-conditioned tent of a familiar material, we can be on our way. Just let's watch Rodan, that's all, Frank Nelsen warned. Sure, we'll keep him good and dopey with tranquilizers. They aroused Dave Lester and Helen Rodan, helped them armor up, explained briefly what the situation was, stuffed Xavier Rodan into his Archer, and climbed with him into the sealable cab of the tractor. Here they could all remove their helmets. After several hours of bumping over rugged country, with the tractor's headlights blazing through the star-topped blackness, they reached a solid trail over a mare. They could zip along, almost, like on a highway. There were other rough stretches, but most of the well-selected route was smooth. Half the time, Nelsen drove while Gimp rested or slept. They ate spaceman's gruel, heated on a little electric stove, and after a certain number of hours, they climbed over the side of the Moon and made their own sunrise. After that, the going seemed easier. Gimp and Frank were just about talked out, by then. Helen Rodan looked after her slumbering father. Otherwise, she and Lester seemed wrapped up in each other. Frank hardly listened to the few words they exchanged. They kept peering eagerly and worriedly along the trail that wound past fantastic scenery. Nelsen was eager and tense himself. Serene, he was thinking with gratitude. Back to some civilization, back to freedom, if there wasn't too much trouble on account of all that had happened. Speeding along, they passed the first scattered domes, a hydroponic garden, an isolated sun power plant. It was another hour before they reached the checking gate of one of the main airlocks. Frank Nelsen didn't try any tricks before the white-armored International Guards. "There have been some difficulties," he said. "I think you will want all of our names." "I am Helen Rodan," Helen interrupted. "My father, Xavier Rodan, here, is sick. He needs a hospital. I will stay with him. These are our friends. They brought us all the way from the far side." Within the broad airlock compartment, Lester also got down from the tractor. "I'll stay too," he said. "Go ahead, Frank. You and Gimp have had enough." "A moment," gruffed one of the guards with a slight accent. "We shall say who shall do what, passing this lock. Difficulties? Very well. Names and space fitness cards, please, from everybody. And where you will be staying here in Serene." Gimp and Frank got permission to pass the lock after about 15 minutes. Without Helen and Les agreeing to stay, it might have been tougher. They spoke their thanks. For the time being, Frank was free to breathe open air under big stellene domes. But he didn't know in what web of questioning and accusations he might soon be entangled. Looking back to his first action against Rodan, with a sharpened trowel that had pierced the wall of the stellene dome, eventually leading up to Dutch's death, and very nearly precipitating his own demise and that of his other companions, he wondered if it wouldn't be regarded as criminal. Now, he wasn't absolutely sure himself that it hadn't been criminal, or moon mad, yet he didn't hate Xavier Rodan any less. "The SOB might just get sent to a mental hospital at the worst," Gimp growled loyally. "Well, come on, Frank. Let's forget it. Ditch our Archies at the hostel, get a cultured steak, and look around to see what you've missed." So that was how Frank Nelsen began to get acquainted with Serene. 15,000 population, much of it habitually transient. A town of vast aspirations, careful discipline, little spotless cubicles for living quarters. Pay $20 a day just for the air you breathe. Earth beer, $20 a can, $1 if synthesized locally. Hydroponic sunflowers, dahlias, poppies, tomatoes, cabbage, all grown enormous in this slight gravity. New chemical synthesis plants, above ground and far below, metal refineries, shops making electronic and nuclear devices, and articles of fabric, glass, rubber, plastic, magnesium. A town of supply warehouses and tanks around a great spaceport. A town of 1,000 unfinished enterprises, and as many paradoxes and inconveniences. No water in fountains. Water in toilets only during part of an Earth day. English, French, Spanish, German, Greek, and Arabic spoken, to mention a few of the languages. An astronomical observatory. A selenographic museum, already open, though less than half completed. And, of course, it was against the law not to work for more than 72 consecutive hours. And over the whole setup there seemed to hang the question, can man really live in space, or does his invasion of it signal his final downfall? At a certain point, Nelsen gave up trying to figure out all of the aspects of Serene. Of course, he and Gimp had one inevitable goal. There was a short walk, Gimp hopping along lightly. Then there was an elevator ride downward, for a place aggressively named the First Stop was nestled cozily in the lava rock underlying the dust of Mare Serenitatis. It had an arched interior, bar, stage, blaring jukebox, tables, and a shoulder-to-shoulder press of tough men, held in curious orderliness in part by the rigid caution needed in their dangerous and artificial existences, in part by the presence of police, and in part, perhaps, by a kind of stored-up awe and tenderness for girls, all girls, who had been out of their lives for too long. In a way, it was a crude, tawdry joint, but it was not the place that Frank and Gimp, or even many of the others, had come to see. Eileen Sands was there, dancing crazy, swoopy stuff, possible at lunar gravity, as Frank and Gimp entered. Her costume was no feminine fluff. Cheesecake, of which she presumably didn't have much, was not on display either. Dungarees still? No, not quite. Slender black trousers, like some girls use for ballet practice, instead. Maybe she wasn't terribly good or sufficiently drilled yet in her routines, but she had a pert, appealing face, a quick smile. Her hair was brushed close to her head. She was a cute, utterly bold pixie to remember smiling at you, just you, like a spirit of luck and love, far out in the thick silence. Her caper ended. She was puffing and laughing and bowing, and maybe sweating some besides. The clapping was thunderous. She came out again and sang Fire Streak in a haunting, husky voice. Meanwhile, a barman touched Frank and Gimp's shoulders. "Hines and Nelson, she has spotted you two. She wants to see you in her quarters." "Hi, lads," she laughed. "Beer for old times. You look like hell, Frank. Brief me on the missing chapter. You had everybody scared." You first, Your Majesty," Nelson chuckled in return. She wrinkled her nose at him. "Well, I got here. There was a need. Somebody decided that I was the best available talent. This is my first step. Maybe I'll have my own spot, bigger and better, or get back to my own regular self, working out there with the men." Maybe it was bad taste, but Nelson felt like teasing. "Ever hear of a person named Miguel Ramos?" That didn't bother her. She shrugged. "Still around, though I hope not for long, the buffoon. Who could ever put up with a show-off small boy like that for more than 10 minutes? Besides, he's wasting himself. Why should he pick me for a bad influence? Now, your chapter, Frank." He told her the story briefly. At last she said, "Frank, you must be spiritually all jammed up. Gimp is set, I know." In a few minutes more, Eileen introduced him to a girl. Jenny Harper had large, dark eyes and a funny, achy sort of voice. Gimp disappeared discreetly with his date. Frank and Jenny sat at a table in a private booth high up in the arches of the first stop and watched Eileen do another number. Jenny explained herself. "I'm another one. I've got to go where the heroes go. That's me, Frankie, is it? So I'm here." She had a perfume. While he was Rodan's prisoner for 2.5 months, there were special things that had driven him almost wild. Now he made hints inevitably. "I don't need Eileen to tell me you're a good guy, Frank," she said, with a small, warm smile. "We're just entertainers. They wouldn't let us be anything else, here." It hardly mattered what else they said. Maybe it was 15 hours later that Frank Nelsen found himself walking along a stellene-covered causeway, looking for left foot Gimp Hines. He had memories of a tiny room, very neat and compact, with even a single huge rose in a vase on the bed table. But the time had a fierce velvet softness that tried to draw him to it for evermore. It was like the grip of a home and the lost earth and the fear that he would chicken out and return. He found Gimp, who seemed worried. "You might get stuck here on account of Rodan," he said. "Even I might. We'd better go see." Nelsen had bitter, vengeful thoughts of Rodan being set at liberty, with himself the culprit. The official at the police building was an American, a gruff one, but human. "I got the dope from the girl, Nelsen," he said, "and from Lester. You're lucky. Rodan confessed to a murder, another employee, just before he hired you. Apparently, just before he made his discovery. He was afraid that the kid would try to horn in. Oh, he's not insane, not enough to escape punishment, anyhow. Here, the official means of execution is simple exposure to the vacuum. Now, if you want to leave serene, you'd better do so soon, before somebody decides to subpoena you as a witness." Frank felt a humbled wonder. Was Rodan really accountable, or was it the moon and space working on people's emotions? Leaving the building, Frank and Gimp found Dave Lester and Helen Rodan entering. They talked for a moment. Then Lester said, "Helen's had lots of trouble, and we're in love. What do we do, guys?" "Don't know. Get married," Nelsen answered, shrugging. "It must happen here, too. Oh, I get it. Living costs off the Earth are high. Well, I've got what Helen's father paid me. Of course I have to replace the missing parts of my equipment, but I'll loan you $500. Wish it could be more." "Shucks, I can do better," Gimp joined in. "Pay us sometime when you see us." "I don't know," Lester protested worriedly, like an honest man. But Gimp and Frank were already shelling out bills, like vagabonds who happened to be flush. "Poor simpletons," Gimp wailed facetiously afterwards, when they had moved out of earshot. "Even here it happens. But that's worse. And if her daddy had stayed human, she might almost have been an heiress. Well, come on, Frank. I've got my space gear out of hock and my tractor sold. An old buddy of ours is waiting for us at a repair and outfitting shop near the spaceport. I hope we didn't jump the gun, assuming you want to get out in the open again." "You didn't," Nelsen answered. "You sure you don't want to look at Rodan's site? See if we can find any more Martian stuff?" Gimp looked regretful for a second. It's jinxed," he said. Ramos, scarred somewhat along the neck and left cheek, and a bit stiff of shoulder, was rueful but very eager. Frank's gutted gear was out of the blastoff drum and spread around the shop. Most of it was already fixed. Ramos had been helping. "Well, Frankie, here's one loose goose who's really glad to be leaving Luna," he said. "Are the asteroids all right with you, for a start?" "They are," Nelsen told him. "Passing close to Mars, which is lined up orbitally along our route," Gimp put in. "Did you beam 2 and 2 and Charlie on Venus?" They're just kind of bored," Ramos said. "I even got Story at the Martian Survey Station, but he's going out into those lousy thickets again. Old Paul in Jarviston sounds the same. Can't get him right now. North America is turned away. I couldn't pinpoint the Kuziks in the belt, but that's not unusual." "I'll finance a load of trade stuff for them," Gimp chuckled. "We ought to be able to move out in about 5 hours, huh?" "Should," Ramos agreed. "Weapons, we might need 'em this trip, and everything else is about ready." "So we'll get a good meal and then buy our load," Frank enthused. He felt the texture of his deflated bub. The hard lines of deep space equipment quickened his pulses. He forgot the call of Earth. He felt as free and easy as a hobo with cosmic dust in his hair. Blast off from Serene's port, even with 3 heavily loaded trader rockets, was comparatively easy and inexpensive. Out in orbit, 3 reunited Bunch members inflated and rigged their bubs. For Nelsen, it seemed an old, splendid feeling. They lashed the supplies from the trader rockets into great bundles that they could tow. Before the rockets began to descend, the trio of beautiful, fragile rings, pushed by ions streaming from their centers, started to accelerate. End of Chapter 4, Part 2.